Հարգելի գործընկերներ, բարև ձեզ, շնորհակալ ենք մեր հրավերն ընդունելու համար։ Ինչպես գիտեք, այսօր տեղի է ունեցել Կենտրոնական բանկի խորհրդի նիստ, որտեղ որոշվել է վերաֆինանսավորման տոկոսադրույքը թողնել անփոփոխ։ Հիմա Կենտրոնական բանկի նախագահ Մարտին Գալստյանը կներկայացնի հաղորդագրությունը, որից հետո արդեն կարող եք ձեր հարցերը հղել իրեն։ Շնորհակալություն։
Շնորհակալություն։ 2023 թվականի մարտի 14-ի նիստում Կենտրոնական բանկի խորհուրդը որոշեց վերաֆինանսավորման տոկոսադրույքը թողնել անփոփոխ, սահմանելով 10.75% մակարդակի վրա։ 23 թվականի փետրվարին 12 ամսյա գնաճը շարունակում է նվազել եւ
Inflation continued to decrease. By the end of the month, it was 8.1. The 12-month core inflation also reduced as well, reaching 8.4. In the first Q of 2023, the economic growth in the world and main partner countries of Armenia remains at a low level. The 12-month inflation slows. Considering the overall inflation environment is sustained because of high demand and pressure coming from the labor market. Therefore, central banks of developed countries will continue to tighten monetary conditions in the near future. This will lead to the weakening of global demand and contribute to a certain drop in prices in international commodity markets. As a result, the inflationary effects of the global economy on the Armenian economy will continue to weaken. The high activity early 2023 in the domestic economy persists, which continues to be driven by strong growth recorded in services and construction. At the same time, high rates of increase in exports and GDP potential are observable in the industry and services. Despite growth in remittances and incomes, private consumption remains subdued. It's expected that it will increase to some extent. The overall inflation environment continues to mitigate. However, high demand and inflation expectations are still driving up wages and prices of certain goods and services. The board of the central bank finds it expedient to leave the policy rate unchanged. The board will be consistent in taking appropriate actions to ensure stabilization of inflation and neutralizing any risk of de-anchoring of inflation expectations. According to the outlined monetary policy scenario, the 12-month inflation will gradually decrease, and from the second half of 2023 will stabilize around the 4% target. The board of the central bank estimates that the risks of inflation deviation from the projected trajectory are mostly balanced. In the event this risk materializes in any direction, the board will be ready to respond accordingly in fulfillment of its price stability objective. Thank you. Arca Agency. Mr. Galstyan, I have several questions. The first, in its baseline scenarios, what is the GDP that annually the central bank estimates? The second question pertains to our exchange. Many experts, not only from Armenia but also foreign experts, indicate that de facto there is no securities market in Armenia. After the Warsaw Exchange, we have no other information other than just regular statements. So what is transpiring in the Armenian exchange? What is the capital market development prospects in your opinion? And the third question, in view of the SVB and Signature Bank events in the United States, what may be the fallout in the international financial system and in particular for Armenia, considering that dozens of Armenian startups are in bad shape in view of this Silicon Valley bank bankruptcy? And with your permission, another question. Considering that there was a significant increase in 22 economic indicators, what are the risks in the banking sector that you foresee? And what, in your opinion, should be the strategy of Armenian banks? Thank you. Let's take it one after the other. Unless you mind, in the press release you see our estimate for 23. According to our projection, it will be 5.8% growth. Like I already read it out in the press release, it will be services and construction, where we expect great growth. And in construction, there is just one big project that will contribute significantly. There will be positive increase in agriculture. Industry will be 5.2%. The main drivers will still be services and construction. As for the stock exchange, then for your information, if I'm not mistaken, in a week before the last, there was a board meeting of the exchange, during which myself and several other members have left the board. A new board has been elected in a natural turn of events. At this point, expecting significant changes would not be appropriate, because the new board is just being formed, followed by drafting a strategy, in approving the strategy. One thing which is obvious is we create an opportunity, that is provide the financial infrastructure, but the issues that you pointed are in the real sector. It is the companies that have to embark on floating and IPOs. Ourselves, as the central bank, and our colleagues from the Warsaw Exchange create the infrastructure to allow them to do so. The third question pertained to SVB insolvency. Naturally, you all heard in the news that it was facing certain financial problems, but the news also followed that the financial regulator and Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, together with the New York Federal Reserve, have decided essentially to guarantee even unsecured deposits in excess of 250,000 US. So I believe that the startups you just referred to, I do not have the information you quoted, but the companies that you pointed to who have deposits or other funds in those banks will be able to claim them. The question in the American financial system boils down basically to the following: whether this contains a risk of contagion. In our assessment, the American regulator's response is mainly aiming at containing the risk of contagion. The depth and the severity of the problem will determine, presumably, the Fed policy, whether to increase or reduce the rate. Before these events, a two-year bond return in the market was 5.1%. The market was expecting the Fed to continue tight, stringent monetary policy to contain inflation, because there are signals from the labor market that the pressures inflationary do not decrease the way the Fed would like it. Inflationary pressures persist, so everyone was expected that in the next meeting the Fed should have continued to increase by steps of 0.25 the rate. According to information I accessed today, half of the market is already expecting the interest rate to remain at the same level, provided they see that the problem is becoming a systemic one. The fourth question pertained to the previous year's indicators of commercial banks and their behavior in 23. In our previous meeting we discussed, and my colleagues from the board already granted interviews. We were listening to a thesis and hypothesis that the funds attracted by commercial banks, mostly current account which is determined by increased numbers of non-resident account holders. There was a blame thrown in the direction of commercial banks. Why don't they use these funds to lend to the economy? Why don't they convert forex or dollars into drams to finance SMEs? 1.6 billion was quoted of funds accumulated in the commercial banks, claiming it would have been more appropriate to lend. Since we are looking at it from the risk management perspective, we believe that our policy should not be forming long-term risks on the expense of short-term. So short-term assets should service short-term liabilities, and that would be the proper balance. To this point, it's end of almost Q1, and the banks continue with this reasonable approach and policy. Thank you. Club of Economic Journalists, determined by the Russian-Ukrainian war, there was a great influx of foreign currency into the economy. Does the central bank considering to do sterilization of remittances? And the next question, if Amulsar mine is commissioned, there will be another influx of forex. Is there any risk of Dutch disease that you observe? Thank you. Since this is our first meeting on this platform, I'll start from afar. The influx of foreign currency and the events in the forex market and its relation to the drams exchange rate. As we mentioned many times before, we depart from the premise that the exchange rate of the Armenian dram is free-floating. The intervention of the central bank in the market is limited to addressing irregular and problematic situations. During last year, we have encountered situations when the central bank intervened in the market developments by acquiring foreign currency. As a result, if I'm not mistaken, through last year, our net purchase out of the financial market was exceeded $900 million in equivalent. As for expected developments, do we expect this trend to persist? If the Amulsar is relaunched or commissioned, whether there will be a certain influx of forex as a result, maybe, but this is just one part in the puzzle. To get a full picture, we have to compare all of the components of our payment balance, since what you mentioned just accounts for the trade or service balance fraction. To get a full picture and as a result to be able to adequately respond to events in the financial market would require us to continue with the policy that has been in place over these last years. Sputnik Armenia, Mr. Galstyan, the FAO index for February published on March 3 acknowledges 11-month slump. You also mentioned that you expect mitigation of inflation. Do you have any analysis how that may express itself in percentage points, perhaps, on imports, on dynamics of imported goods? The FAO I will comment on in general terms. If there is a need to spell it down further, Hike will. 3 out of these charts are exactly about FAO. You see essentially that over the recent months the FAO index was stable essentially. If we compare it, let's say, with 2020, the 2017 is baseline, but the 2020 is not changed much over 17. The main growth was after Q2 of 2020. We see that this index stabilized. There are no new trends of increase, but it stabilized on a higher level than the baseline year. It's over by 50% compared to the plateau of 2020. If you look at the breakdown by commodities, oils grew from 100 to 240. They went down to 130 now. There are some commodities such as meat, dairies that have stabilized on a lower level. There are commodities such as cereals, which is 50% more expensive than the baseline. So the trends that are registered indicate the following. We have certain decrease or at least stabilization. As for the future, since there are expectations that the central banks with their stringent monetary policy may possibly result in US and developed countries certain economic slowing and the recession that may cause these commodities prices to go down. That's what our expectation is hinged on. As a result of that decrease, we will not have substantial external pressures. Our projections of FAO index have already been displayed. As it was mentioned, there is significant substantial decrease. We expect a little bit more of a decrease, and that will naturally have its impact visible. If we look here at this one, we have non-seasonal food commodities segment, and its contribution to our inflation significantly shrinks. This is the impact of the FAO index on our prices. If we look at the observations of the last few months, there is a negative impact, which is a positive background. If halfway through the year, food commodities group inflation was up to 15–16%, whereas the 12-month inflation over this group of commodities is 9.7, and we expect further decrease determined by decrease in international food commodity prices. About China, do you expect subsequent increase of economic acceleration about food products? As for metal prices, what are your expectations? Our last projection is we expect copper prices essentially to increase over year, determined by the rebound in Chinese economy and higher economic growth than they had in 22. 9,000 $1,100 on the average annually per metric ton. It was mentioned that foreign demand for Armenian goods and services, it's not only resettled Russians but also tourist flows. Do you estimate that this year these tourist flows will persist, considering that it is not impossible that there may be purchasing power negative dynamics in Russia? Although this year it's expected that their economic decline will even out, it would be hard to say. It will, whatever I tell you would be just a logical construct. The surveys by our colleagues have indicated that the international visitors who are in Armenia have started to make longer-term plans with respect to Armenia and the Armenian economy. That's good news. As for what will transpire in the Russian economy, it would be difficult for me to make any projections, but the growth will be either negative or positive, around zero. We do not expect too much of a positive growth. Nevertheless, there are certain limitations on travel for Russian citizens and tourism. Therefore, we expect that in Armenia we will continue to receive further tourists from Russia, which will have another positive impact on the subsequent development of on the expect of restructuring tourist flows out of Russia. This is my personal estimate that through this year, if the geopolitical situation doesn't get worse, we may even see some pickup in other international visitors or tourists incoming to Armenia. One more question with respect to Russia. According to your projections, considering the 10th package of sanctions that was enacted, do you expect over the course of the year new sanction packages that may limit re-exporting opportunities or the possibility for Armenia to act as a trade bridge which will shrink the additional surplus inflows that the country has? I will refrain from commenting on this issue. With your permission. H2. Mr. Galstyan, nevertheless, the influx of Russians to this country, what did it change in the domestic financial economic balance? Their presence has resulted in hiking the real estate rents and the depreciation of foreign currency, the devaluation of foreign exchange. How did it affect those groups who depend on it? Quite naturally, there will be groups that, as a result of evaluation of dram, will encounter certain difficulties. But at the same time, we should depart from the fact that the mandate of the central bank is price stability, and we target the overall price level which bound the central bank to follow the inflation in the country, which has an impact not only on those who engage in forex relations and have forex flows, but the general population as well. This was done in a well-weighted and premeditated manner. We stick to our mandate without ruling out that there may be groups, mostly exporters, who may also encounter certain difficulties. Looking at the overall macro situation, you may see that there was a great increase in exports through the year, and if you classify the exporters, not all of them have encountered this issue. For example, those who export to the Russian Federation, over the year, the situation fluctuated. The Russian ruble also appreciated, and there is no significant changes in the parity between the AMD and Russian rubles has taken place, whereas the demand for Armenian goods in the Russian market has significantly increased, which pushed our economic agents to increase their exports. There is another interesting phenomenon. The government, has programs of encouraging companies to invest in new equipment, and we see that the flywheel of this program is gaining speed. There is a double effect. On the one hand, government significantly subsidizes the acquisition, whether on leasing terms or through loans, this equipment. And on the other hand, if this equipment is procured in Europe, they are acquired in euros, and because of the fall of the euro, they are in beneficial situation. So we need to disaggregate this further for meaningful analysis. As a general statement that the exchange rate affects certain groups, yes, it may. As for the first question pertaining to Russian Federation or Ukraine or Belarus international visitors to Armenia, I'll start with the non-economic aspect. There is significant positive shift for the better in Armenia. The presence of these people affects the culture, the taste, the relations, and I believe that's a very welcome phenomenon. As for the economic developments, then we see that the external demand that these visitors create has to some extent increased the prices here, resulting in a certain challenge, if we are frank, for the central bank. On this chart you see the black column is the services inflation. You see that the chart starts with 2019, but even in the decade preceding it, the black column would not have been there. The prices for services, these types of services, hard prices, have never changed and do not change over decades, whereas now, after the influx of international visitors, if you look at the black segment of the column, it significantly increased in Armenia. If we look at the main objective of the central bank in the context of inflation is to keep exactly these types of prices stable, which is why on the one hand we see that international commodity markets result in the supply factor positive dynamics, but demand-driven inflation continues to remain high. So our today's central bank board decision essentially is an attempt, a result of the approach to balance these two approaches. We will be persistent in stabilizing these prices. It is these prices, hard prices and services, that are in the focus of the monetary policy, in the target of the monetary policy of the central bank. My question pertained to the services. In your assessment, the overheating of the labor market, will it persist or not? And if you expect a greater increase of the GDP over the previous estimate from 4.5 to 5.8, isn't this based on the increased labor force, or is it hinged on increased productivity? Have you factored into the analysis this re-equipment of companies and increased productivity? Will it impact the productivity this year? Good question. Let's break it down into two components to make things clearer. On the left chart, you see the gray, it's unregulated services. Q over Q, annualized growth remains within 6%. It's higher than the inflation target of the central bank. This is the component that is of concern for us. The second concerning component is inflationary expectations. The uncertainty and high inflation rate expectations weight has increased. But compared to pre-COVID, pre-war situation, we still have quite high inflationary expectations. These are the two phenomena that underlie our decision. As for your question, why did we increase the economic growth estimate and what are the determining factors? You're quite right. Partially it's determined by increased potential. So we not only reviewed the economic growth estimates, but we think that the potential economic growth will increase in the coming years, significantly determined by the growth in economy in 23, including the Amulsar project, which perhaps in 24 we will already see in the outcomes of the industry. But at the same time, there is also a certain increase in productivity, which we see both because of the work ethics of the incoming workforce, and that impact is already visible in certain, and then it's the new technologies introduction by certain sectors and companies. Dear colleagues, unless there are other questions. About the demand, have you observed, does this transmission mechanism deliver? The refinancing rate has remained high for quite a while. Did you observe any impact on consumer loans or the interest policy of the banks or the behavior of consumers towards diminishing? The transmission mechanism naturally delivers to a certain extent, but at the same time, the year 22 was quite specific, and we understand the financial system earned returns from the non-financial, so they did not have to attract new funds. On the other hand, there was also another interesting phenomenon through the last year. A big segment of companies have prematurely repaid their accumulated loan commitments, at the same time accumulating significant deposits. So the increase in 22, the impact was substantially felt also by real sector companies. But the issue that was pointed out in the past persists. The companies retain more of time deposits without investing, without putting them into circulation. Yes, we see both natural and legal persons, international visitors, but we also have Armenian companies which also have funds on their current accounts, but also have deposits invested, which at a certain point presumably will contribute to launching certain projects, but quite naturally that is hinged to geopolitical uncertainties as well. What's your observation? Will the banks continue to receive non-interest income in such high proportions as they did last year? And will this not restrain their appetite to attract new loans? We believe the momentum will not be the same as last year. As for attracting loan funding, I think if there is a demand by the real sector to borrow, the banks have accumulated enough capital and have the means to offer those loans. Unless there are other questions, dear colleagues, thank you very much. Thank you.